Well, I hope I can do the topic justice. I'll tell you right now, the answer is both. And I'll explain what I mean in just a second. Now, libertarians in general, we walk a fine line. Large businesses often face unfair accusations of exploitation and anti-competitive practice that really they should not be subject to. However, these same large businesses often benefit from regulation that grants them very unfair advantages over competitors, consumers, and suppliers. So we've kind of got this fine line to tread where we have to defend business without becoming apologists for corporatism. And Kohl's and Woolworths are a pretty good example of that. Now, the good. So these are great things that Kohl's and Woolworths have done. That they have a broad distribution of stores, and that means reliable and consistent access to quality products, which of course is met with accusations of a duopoly. They have economy of scales and efficient supply chains. It means lowers prices for consumers. I think the ACCC said it was about 15% decrease in prices where there was a Kohl's or a Woolworths. And of course that is accusations of predatory pricing. In response to that, the success of Aldi and Costco suggests otherwise, that you have a very low consumer loyalty in the supermarket market. I think most of us don't necessarily go to Woolworths because, yeah, I'm a Woolworths man or I'm a Kohl's man. No, this is on my street corner as I'm walking home, and so I'm going to buy what's there. That's evidenced by the fact that Woolworths has a 28% market share, and only 7% of people shop exclusively at Woolworths. That there's very little consumer loyalty. That you don't care where your groceries come from as long as they come to you. An example of a successful competitor entering the market is Aldi. By 2020, they'll have doubled the number of stores. And I think it's fairly obvious that if it's a duopoly, it's not doing a very good job of maintaining its market share. So I think that by and large, we can say that as competitors go, they exist, and Kohl's and Woolworths are not to blame. However, the bad, there's a vast network of regulation that impedes smaller competitors from entering the business. And if you look at regulatory compliance costs, tend to be high fixed costs with a relatively low variable cost. So that might mean something that 1,000 employees would require 10 of them for regulatory compliance, so about 1%. If you had 100 employees, you might need 5 of them for regulatory compliance, and that suddenly becomes 5%. And if you only have 10 employees, you might need 1 full-time to do regulatory compliance, so that's 10% of your employee costs. And everything sort of scales along that way. That the smaller businesses have a much harder time complying with regulation. And that basically raises the cost of entry into these markets. And another particular one that supermarkets seem to be guilty of is, and it's not just Kohl's and Woolworths, it's inactive abuse of zoning and planning, which prevents competing branches from opening entirely. It's not just raising the cost of entry, it's saying they cannot build there. An example in Queensland, actually, this was IGA, tried to block a Costco approval for building at a site. And even an accusation, this sort of thing, ties up production for a year or two at a time. That even if they can eventually prove that, no, we should be allowed to open our store, we should be allowed to freely sell you things for a lower price than our competition, it can take 2 years. And that's enough to sometimes prevent the plan from going ahead at all. And this actually took an executive decision by the deputy premier, which, I think a lot of times libertarians don't like for good reason, these sorts of executive decisions, but every now and then it can be used for a good thing. And also, producers face the regulatory barriers to selling directly to consumers. And the example I'm going to be looking at is milk pricing for the majority of this talk. And it's something that if you hear about the suppliers being squeezed, a lot of that could be done could be gotten around if you actually allow the producers to sell directly to consumers, and there's lots of barriers to that. And so raw milk ban is sort of a good example of that. That milk suppliers have a hard time selling directly to consumers, and there's a nice creative way around that. That in South Australia, someone was selling shares in their cow. And effectively, they're not selling raw milk. They're just paying milk dividends, which I think is a nice little way for the market to circumvent these sorts of regulations. All right, so the ugly, and this is regulatory capture. That at the beginning of or at the end of last month, ACCC sort of announced it was delaying the results of investigations into Kohl's and Woolworths. And the investigation was possibly unconscionable conduct in their dealings with the suppliers. It's a very strong word. And there was also an investigation into petrol dockets because Australian consumers were getting their gas for far too cheap for the government to be happy. And they said they were going to hold off because it was a complicated situation. They needed more time to check. So the decision should arrive late 2013 and early 2014. And now, miraculously, coincidentally, a couple weeks later, a voluntary agreement was reached by Coles, Woolworths, and the Australian Food and Grocery Council. And just a small pet peeve of mine, anytime someone says specifically that an agreement is voluntary, don't trust them, because agreements by their nature are voluntary. I've never heard of an involuntary agreement, generally speaking. So the fact that it's always said this is a voluntary code of conduct, a voluntary agreement, usually means there was some external pressure there. And an interesting thing about this I found when I was looking it up is that while the code is voluntary, it will be included in the Competition and Consumer Act with Mr. Bilson. And he's warning that if it fails to meet expectations, the government may take its own action. So we have this thing that was written by Coles and Woolworths. It's being written voluntarily into this act, and the government has already threatened to make it, well, perhaps not it, but some modified form of it mandatory. And now, going forward, the government and the ACCC have to approve this plan put forward by Coles and Woolworths. And then finally, after that, other retailers and suppliers get a rubber stamp. And that, to me, it certainly smacks of suspicious activity, maybe not outright regulatory capture, but and in the end, the investigation is continuing, and we'll hear exactly what they have to say about cheap petrol prices or unconscionable pressure on their suppliers. So, all right, now the case that I'm going to be looking at here is milk pricing. And this is, I think, an example of unfair accusations against Coles and Woolworths. And my edits did not get saved? So it should say milk prices are too low, not too high. Which this is actually a very reasonable complaint. Milk prices are too high, but no. The complaint is, in fact, that milk prices are too low. That Australian consumers are getting milk for too cheap. And I just like to say that there's a few things we need to establish. First of all, I don't think these are controversial points. Producers want to sell their product for the highest price they can. Consumers want to buy their product for the lowest price they can. And retailers, who act in between those two, they want to buy their products at the lowest price from the producers and sell their products at the highest price to consumers. And the reason that supermarket milk is so cheap is because it's a loss leader, which is a type of good. So hopefully my new plots are up here. So this is a very simple model of a retail interaction. That you have producers who are selling wholesale to retailers and possibly retailing directly to consumers, and the retailers are then selling to consumers. And there's two prices that matter here. There's the retail price, which is the price that consumers buy their milk at. That's you and I and most of us. The wholesale price is basically between the producers and the retailers, between the farmers and the supermarkets. And for the purposes of this talk, I'm assuming that this is a very small part of the milk market. I don't have any evidence to support this directly, but given that 1 in 5 Australians lived in Sydney, I don't think a lot of them are going outside of there and going directly to the farm to get their milk. So I think that this is a relatively small component of the milk market. Most milk is sold through supermarkets, through retailers. So our simplified model then is this. Now, we have farmers who are selling wholesale to supermarkets, who are selling then to consumers. So the accusation that supermarket prices are too low for milk. Now, that's talking about the retail price of milk. And I'm going to tell you right now that this has nothing to do with the wholesale price for milk. It's a loss leader. So these two things are governed by two different sets of forces. That the wholesale price is governed by the desire of farmers to sell their milk as expensive as possible, and supermarkets to buy that milk as cheaply as possible. Well, the retail price is governed by the supermarkets wanting to sell their goods as expensive as possible, and the consumers wanting to buy their goods as cheaply as possible. Now, a loss leader is something where it's sold at a lower rate to the consumers in the expectation that those consumers will buy other goods from the retailer and will end up making a higher profit. So you don't just buy milk most of the time. I mean, maybe some of us live on milk, but most people buy other groceries as well. And so we'll walk in, we'll buy our cheap milk, and it's great, yes, cheap milk, and then we'll go buy, expensive frozen dinners or frozen noodles or whatever it is that we subsist on. Separate from the wholesale price, because the wholesale price is supermarkets are selling their milk as a loss leader, but they still want to get the cheapest price. If they were selling milk at $100 per liter, they would still want to get the cheapest price they could from their suppliers. And they would have an incentive to bargain down the price there. So there is very, very little link between the retail price of milk and the wholesale price of milk, if we're assuming that there is a small market for direct sale to consumers. So another example to make this a little more clear, I think that we also have experience with this, and this is movie tickets. Movie tickets in a lot of cases are a loss leader good. Consumers pay relatively cheap, well, it might not seem that cheap, but it's relatively cheap prices to movie theaters, who are paying quite a lot for the privilege of showing the movie. And if you ever wonder why popcorn is so expensive, that's because that's where the theaters are making their profits on. That you buy $20 for a few kernels of popcorn. That's where the money is being made for theaters. And so when you hear about farmers complaining about the retail price of milk, it's a lot like movie studios complaining about movie tickets being too cheap. It doesn't quite make sense. It's that they're making their money by selling to theaters. Farmers are making most of their money by selling to supermarkets. And while they have a right to complain about the wholesale price, and justly or not, it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to talk about the retail price. And in fact, if we accept that this is the model of what's going on in the milk market, we get another thing. And this is a third example I have, which was inspired by Jeffrey Tucker's talk. Now, let's say I'm a Swedish chef, which is only a quarter true, and I produce Vegemite muffins. I have a factory that produces Vegemite muffins, which I then sell to retailers of muffins, say the Tucker Muffin shop. All right, so let's say he thinks that Vegemite muffins are so popular and such a staple in everyone's diet, and all of us Australians, that he's going to offer them for free. He's going to give them away in the hope that people will buy his other muffins, and he'll actually make a profit on that. So he's shot down the retail price of muffins. And that actually increases consumer demand for Vegemite muffins. If they're free, people want to consume a lot of them. And so giving away muffins, consumers want more of them. Now, what effect does that have on Tucker muffins? That means that retailer demand also increases. That assuming it's still rational for him to give away these muffins, that he wants to make sure he has enough muffins to give away so people are buying all the other great things that Tucker Muffins sells. And so what effect does that have on the wholesale price? That the wholesale price then goes up, that there's a higher demand for Vegemite muffins from the producers of muffins. And that actually could drive up the producer profit. And as the Bard says, as with muffins, so it is with milk, that this is actually analogous, that you have milk prices, if they are low and it stimulates demand, supermarkets have to buy more milk from farmers, and that actually will act as an upward push on milk prices. So it's not clear to me. It's certainly is clear to the farmers, but it's not so clear to me that low retail prices is bad for the Australian milk industry. So that actually does conclude it. I've gone through fairly fast. I know that we're pushing up against the break. So I'd like to hear some questions, because there's a lot more to talk about this. But basically, there are a lot of accusations leveled against Coles and Woolworths that are completely unfair. And the milk pricing thing is one of them. But at the same time, we really have to acknowledge that they have a lot of thrust and a lot of power in government. And not everything they do is so squeaky clean as selling cheap milk. And I think that it's very important. In fact, justice demands that we acknowledge both of these things that are going on. Both the anti-market and the corporatist advocates are wrong, and we have to challenge both of them simultaneously. We don't want to be seen as supporting one over the other in any of these cases. So I think I'll have a few questions. Yeah.
Very, very interesting topic. Thank you very much. One thing that I did a tiny little bit of looking into it, and what is your view on the pasteurisation laws and their impact on milk prices specifically? And suppose that I think there's a duopoly in pasteurisation.
Yeah, so I think I touched on that very briefly, on the fact that the raw milk ban does actually have a huge impact on farmers, and I think that if we really wanted to help out farmers, I think that would be a great step forward to stop forcing them to pasteurize their milk. And I don't know, I've never actually had raw milk. I like the generic supermarkets junk, but I understand that a lot of people do really like raw milk. And I think that since there does seem to be such a demand for it, it's people are willing to buy cow shares, and just so they can get their raw milk. Like that's a pretty strange thing to do. So I think if there's such a demand for it, legalizing the sale of raw milk would go a long way to driving up milk prices.
If I can buy bathing milk from a farm, I'm going to buy that at $5 for 4 litres.
Bathing milk.
Yes. It's called Egyptian.
I've also never bathed in milk, so I can't speak directly to that.
Can you just explain how you know that milk is a loss leader?
I'm not so sure it's necessarily a loss leader. I don't know that they're losing money on it, but it definitely is indicative of value in the Australian supermarket culture. That they advertise it so much that whether or not they're making a small profit or they're losing a little bit of money, it is undervalued compared to, I think, what they could get if it was just selling milk. I'm sure that they could raise prices on milk and make higher total profits on milk. I think that actually Coles and Woolworths, their fresh products tend to be undervalued. and then their sort of their frozen food section and their home brand stuff is what tends to be overvalued, and that's where they make most of their money on?
Just that everyone knows, the enterprising cow-sharing farmer has been charged with criminal offences in Adelaide. He went to court, I think 2 weeks ago, so it's now awaiting a judgment, but he does. Although, yeah, he said that Glorious State is now potentially threatening with large fines and possibly even jail.
Insider milking, yeah, it's a problem.
Yeah, just about this raw milk thing again. In New Zealand, you can buy it at the farm gate. You can go and buy your personal use amounts of raw milk, and they don't even have to label it bath milk or.
Well, that's fantastic.
That's in New Zealand.
I know the problem is actually in the U.S. as well. It's illegal in some states, and there's some great footage if you look of a SWAT team raiding a farm for selling. I think it was unpasteurized milk and cheese, and it's a farm. That these guys running around with their automatic weapons and their SWAT gear and their toys, and really protecting the consumer from that dangerous bathing milk.
All right, I'm afraid that's all the time we have for questions. So please thank Austen for his talk.